Some friendships leave marks on our souls, etched by time, laughter, and memories we believed would last forever. But the past has a way of creeping back in ways we could never anticipate. What happens when those we left behind return, carrying secrets darker than we ever imagined? Tonight, we dive into one such tale, a story where buried truths resurface and the weight of unspoken depths can no longer be ignored. Welcome to Echoing Tales, where every whisper tells a story. Tonight's story is titled The Unspoken Depth. The reunion was in full swing. Laughter echoed through the large banquet hall as old friends from the class of 1994, along with their spouses, filled the room. Paras stood with his wife Naina at his side, scanning the crowd for familiar faces. It had been 20 years since they had all met, and time had carved its marks on each of them. Grey hairs, slight wrinkles, softer waistlines, and the weariness that adulthood brings. Some carried themselves with quiet confidence. Others moved with subtle caution, warned by the weight of life. A few had done incredibly well, while others had faded into obscurity. Paras, once lean and energetic, now had a few silver strands and a more thoughtful gaze, though he still carried an air of quiet strength. Naina, elegant as ever, had aged gracefully. Her dark hair was tied back and her warm eyes radiated kindness. Paras was now a successful author, and he had come with Naina from Bangalore. "Paras!" a familiar voice called out. It was Rishabh, his old friend, now settled in Canada, a successful IT consultant. His once lean frame had thickened over the years, but his mischievous grin remained unchanged. Beside him stood his wife, beaming with warmth. "Look at you, man," Rishabh continued. "You haven't aged a day. And you've got Naina here keeping you grounded, I bet." Jatin, the third musketeer from college, soon joined them, along with his wife. His hairline had receded, and his face bore the traces of sleepless nights and long workdays. Yet, his eyes sparkled with the same lively energy they had in their youth. He had made a name for himself in Delhi, running a law firm. The conversation flowed easily as memories of singing in the canteen, late-night hostel sessions, and spontaneous bike rides to Gandhinagar for tea resurfaced. They had all studied at a prestigious college in Ahmedabad, and though Gandhinagar was nearly 30 kilometers away, that never stopped them from hopping on bikes late at night just for a cup of tea from a street vendor they swore made the best chai. Naina smiled quietly as the men laughed about their antics. "Remember when Paras ran out of gas halfway?" Rishabh teased. "We had to push his bike in the middle of the night." "And Jatin got caught sneaking in and blaming Rishabh," Paras added, grinning. They joked about pranks on professors and Jatin getting stuck on the hostel roof, rescuing a stray kitten. "We were fearless," Jatin laughed. "Or just crazy." As they reminisced, Paras handed Rishabh a box. "Your favorite Indian sweet made by Naina herself." Naina smiled but remained quiet. The truth was the sweets were prepared by Sheila Di, their cook. Paras often gave her credit for elaborate meals, and though Naina hated it, she never made a scene. Paras believed he did it out of love, not wanting anyone to compare her to his late mother, who had been an excellent cook. Naina, however, hated taking credit for something she hadn't done. It was a recurring argument between them. Suddenly, a ripple of attention moved through the room as a woman walked in with a renowned businessman. She was stunning, commanding the room's attention with her elegance. "Anagha," Jatin whispered, his eyes wide. "She hasn't changed a bit." As Anagha approached, they exchanged pleasantries. But once she was out of earshot, Jatin gave a knowing look to Paras and Rishabh. His wife noticed and raised an eyebrow. "All right, who had a crush on her back in college?" Jatin smirked. All of us in the first year. But she fell for someone completely unexpected. Neil. Nana furrowed her brows. Neil? I've never heard Paras mention him. Nana was hearing Neil's name for the first time, and as she listened, she tried to make sense of it all. Rishabh glanced at Paras and said, You know, Paras and Neil were inseparable back in college. He and Paras were roommates, and Jatin and I shared the room next door. We all had twin sharing rooms with a common toilet, so we practically lived together. Rishabh began, a nostalgic smile playing on his lips. Nana noticed how Paras shifted uncomfortably as Rishabh continued. Neil was loaded, son of one of the biggest textile merchants in Surat. But his home life was a mess. His mom died when he was a teenager, and after his dad remarried, things just got worse. His stepmother didn't like him, and once she had her own child, they completely ignored Neil. When he left for college, it was almost like a relief for him. Nana's mind wandered to Paras's own story. She knew her husband had grown up with a single mother, his father passing away when he was just a boy. His mom was a school teacher, barely making ends meet. Paras had made it to college purely on merit and scholarship, but the struggles were always there. Paras and Neil shared a bond so close it was as if they were always together, connected by a deep friendship that few could understand. Jatin added, pulling Naina's attention back to the conversation. They bonded over books and movies. While Rishabh and I would chat about actors and directors, Neil and Paras would stay up late into the night talking about writers, poets, and scripts. They both had this love for storytelling. Rishabh smiled softly. Neil, despite everything, was deeply attached to his mother. Most kids in India start their notebook with Om, but Neil, he'd write Uma, his mom's name, on every notebook and project he worked on. After she passed from cancer, he even got her name tattooed on his arm. Jatin's face darkened as he picked up the thread of the story. But things went south fast. Neil was troubled. He hated his father, hated his life, and he began acting out. Drinking, smoking, skipping classes. He was brilliant, but all that pain buried his potential. He had to spend money like it was nothing, probably to numb himself. Rishabh's voice grew somber. Paras did a lot for Neil, but Neil did just as much for him. He paid for Paras's meals, his trips, even helped with things Paras couldn't afford. But it was a twisted kind of friendship. Neil always expected something in return. Rishabh nodded, his expression serious now. Then came the fights. Neil first got into a fight with the librarian and then another one with the canteen contractor. 2 strikes, and finally the exam paper theft. Naina noticed how quiet Paras had become, his jaw tight. She sensed there was more to the story than what was being said. Jatin leaned in slightly, his voice dropping. Rishabh and I heard them fighting that night. Neil was shouting at Paras, but we couldn't make out what it was about. When we rushed in, Neil stormed out of the room. Paras, shaken, told us everything. Neil had stolen the exam paper and wanted Paras to take the blame. Since Paras was a top scholar and well liked by the dean, he would probably go easy on him. Neil, on the other hand, was on his 3rd strike. Naina looked at Paras, her heart sinking. You never told me any of this. Rishabh's voice softened. Neil was expelled after that. His father disowned him, and Anaga, his girlfriend, left him too. He disappeared after that. No one knew where he went. Jatin's voice lowered, tinged with sorrow. The rumors about Neil's fate were all over the place. Some said he was working as an assistant director for a famous filmmaker, while others whispered that his father had taken him back and sent him to London to clean up his act. Another rumor claimed he was living as a recluse in the hills somewhere. but nobody knew for sure. Rishabh nodded grimly. One of our classmates, though, had a chilling encounter. He claimed to have seen Neil at a railway station in Lucknow. When he approached him, Neil was unrecognizable. His beard was scraggly, his frame thin and gaunt. He asked about Anaga and Paras with a haunting detachment. As the classmate was leaving, Neil made a desperate plea for money. Jatin's eyes clouded with a somber memory. Someone claimed to have seen a man who resembled Neil sitting among the homeless outside a famous temple. He was wrapped in a tattered shawl, blending in with those waiting for food from passing devotees. The man looked broken, a ghost of his former self, as if everything that once defined him had slipped away. Naina watched Paras, the gravity of the tales etching deeper lines of regret on his face. The story was unraveling in ways she hadn't anticipated, and it was clear that the weight of Neil's downfall was still pressing heavily on him. His face was tense, his eyes distant. She realized in that moment that Paras carried an unbearable guilt. He had never forgiven himself for not taking the blame that day, and Neil's descent into madness haunted him still. If you're enjoying the story so far and want to support our new channel, please consider subscribing, liking and sharing this video. Your encouragement means a lot to us as we bring you more mysterious and thrilling tales. Now, to continue with the story. After the reunion ended with hugs, laughter and promises to meet more often, Naina and Paras bid farewell to their old friends and made their way to the car. As they drove back to their hotel, the night was hauntingly silent, a heavy fog hanging in the air. The chill of the evening seeped through the car, and the world outside seemed to be shrouded in darkness. The only sounds were the steady hum of the engine and the occasional creak of the car's suspension. Naina glanced out the window, her breath misting up the glass. Suddenly, Jatin's words from earlier at the reunion echoed in Naina's mind. Neil always said we would meet again, every 10 or 15 years, no matter where we are, he had remarked. He was the one always talking about reunions. The thought seemed oddly prophetic as the road stretched endlessly before them. Without warning, Paras slammed the brakes. In the middle of the road stood a figure, disheveled and wild-eyed, as if conjured from the darkness itself. Paras's eyes widened in recognition, his heart pounding. The man, seemingly emerging from the shadows, lunged towards the car. Paras swerved violently, trying to avoid the apparition, but the car skidded uncontrollably. The world spun, metal screeched, and the sound of shattering glass filled the air. The car rolled over, crashing into the cold, hard ground with a bone-jarring impact. When Naina regained consciousness, she was trapped in the crumbled wreckage. Her body ached from the crash, but she was relatively unharmed. Paras, however, was in worse shape, blood seeping from a gash on his forehead. The car's interior was a twisted mess of metal and shattered glass. Through the haze of pain and confusion, Naina saw the figure from the road approaching them. He stood outside the wreck, his silhouette dark and menacing against the dim moonlight. As he drew closer, the temperature seemed to plummet, the night growing colder with each step he took. The night was deathly still as Naina tried to catch her breath, pinned inside the wreckage of the car. Paras lay groaning beside her, barely conscious, blood trickling down his forehead. Through the shattered window, a figure emerged. A man, his face shadowed by a thick, untamed beard. His hollow eyes met Naina's, sending a shiver down her spine. Without a word, he extended his hand. Naina hesitated, feeling a chill crawl up her arm as she took it. His hand was cold, too cold. As he pulled her out of the car, she noticed a tattoo, Uma, etched into his wrist in delicate script. Her breath hitched, and now, in the pale moonlight, the horrifying truth began to sink in. This man was Neil. Neil didn't speak to her, his voice shifting to the wrecked car, his gaze dark and cold. He stepped closer, crouching beside Paras, whose face twisted in pain. His voice was soft, but laced with venom, barely more than a whisper. You took my life, my love, and my work. Paras groaned, too weak to respond. Neil's tone darkened as he continued. The first strike, I fought with the librarian because you couldn't afford to pay the fine for that book you borrowed. She threatened to report you, so I took the fall. No one knew that, did they? Neil's eyes glinted with malice as he relived the memory. The second strike, the fight with the canteen contractor, you didn't have the money to pay for your meals, and he refused to serve you. I stood up for you, but it cost me my place in the university's good graces. Naina's pulse quickened. She had heard Paras's stories, but he had never mentioned these movements, not like this. Her mind raced, piecing together the lies that had concealed the truth for so long. Neil's voice pierced the silence, sharper now. Do you remember that night before the exam, Paras? You were sick. You were terrified of failing, scared you to lose your scholarship. His tone grew more intense as he continued. So I went to the dean's office and stole the exam paper. For you, I got caught. That was my third strike. Neil's voice faltered, a deep sadness creeping in. And the worst part? I never asked you to take the blame like you told others. I would have left college without a second thought if it meant helping you. Naina's heart pounded as the revelations unfolded. Her eyes flickered to Paras, who was motionless, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Neil's face twisted in pain as he leaned closer to Paras. But that manuscript, that was mine. I poured my soul into it, every word, every thought, every piece of me. It was never just a book, Paras. His voice cracked. I lost it the night before I was expelled. I thought you had taken it by mistake, that maybe it got mixed up with your things. Isn't that what I was arguing with you about that night? That was the fight Rishabh and Jatin saw. Neil's eyes blazed with a fury that had been simmering for years. Then many years later, I saw your name in the newspaper. I was happy, Paras. I really was. I thought, finally my friend had made it. You were famous. Your first novel published. His voice dropped, cold and cutting, as if the very air had turned icy. Inspired by your success, I decided to give my script another shot. I rewrote it, thinking I could finally make something of myself. So, I went to a producer, full of hope. Neil's expression darkened. But he laughed in my face, called me a thief, said I had stolen someone else's work. Neil's voice cracked, his face twisted in disbelief. I didn't understand until I read your book. That's when it hit me. It wasn't just inspiration. Was it? You took everything from me, Paras. My manuscript, my work, my life. Naina gasped, her mind flashing back to that day in Paras's study. She had found an old dusty diary tucked away. Inside she had seen notes, fragments of the very book that had launched Paras's career. And on the first page, scrawled in neat handwriting, was the name Uma. Terror surged through her as she connected the dots. her breath coming in ragged gasps. The truth was a bitter poison. Paras wasn't a genius. He was a thief. Neil's face contoured with anguish as he stood towering over Paras. I lost my mother, my father, Anaga, and finally I lost you. But what killed me was losing my work. You destroyed me. Naina felt her body tremble as she watched Neil take a step back, his hollow eyes fixed on Paras, who was now gasping for air. The wind howled cold and biting, swirling around them as Neil's presence darkened the night. With a final eerie whisper, Neil's voice echoed through the air. You reduced my life to nothing but shadows. He took one last look at Paras, then turned towards Naina. For a brief moment, his gaze softened as he met her eyes. And then, without warning, he vanished into the night. Suddenly, the car exploded into flames, the fire engulfing the wreckage with a violent roar. Naina screamed, stumbling back as the heat seared her skin. The last image she saw before everything turned to chaos was the name Uma burning on the smouldering remains of a diary. The truth had been consumed by fire, but its shadow would haunt her forever. This is an original work of fiction created by Echoing Tales, a brand new channel blending suspense and mystery. Join us as we unravel a story shrouded in eerie echoes and spine-chilling twists every week. As we are just starting out, we need your support. So don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like the video and hit the bell icon to help us keep creating more captivating stories. Until we meet again in the next tale, stay vigilant. And before you sleep tonight, remember to take one last look into the darkness.